Well, I think the key factors will be whether we start to see some improvement in the macroeconomic numbers for Asia, especially on the exports front. I think we're starting to see some early glimpse, especially from the PMI numbers in the past few months. At the same time, if the Federal Reserve were to continue with this steady monetary policy for much of this year, and therefore allowing some of the Asian central banks to ease monetary policy in the first half of this year, I think this risk-on environment can be extended going into the late first quarter of this year, even the second quarter.
Tai, it does seem like the global economic outlook, though, is stabilising. Is there a risk that perhaps a more hawkish Fed in the second half of the year could be a serious risk to the equity market outlook?
That's a great question. That's a question that a lot of our clients are asking right now. If you look at, for example, the core inflation in the US and other parts of the world, it's still pretty contained. I think this is where the developed market central banks, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, will be focusing on rather than the headline inflation. And at the same time, don't forget, inflation has been undershooting targets for most of these central banks in the past few years, and therefore, even if we do see core inflation rising above their objective for a brief period, that may not be sufficient to push central banks to be more hawkish. And therefore, I think the threshold for a interest rate hike by the Fed or other central banks continues to be pretty high.
So, Tai, how do you allocate in this environment then? Is it safe to stay with EM Asia with a bias towards China?
Well, I think, again, in the short term, next 3 to 6 months, I do think that Asian equities are in a pretty strong position for a couple of reasons. We mentioned earlier the fact that the global trade cycle is improving, and that should be beneficial to the earnings outlook. Secondly, if we do have a steady US dollar and the Fed maintain its current policy stance, again, this will encourage more inflow into Asia, into emerging markets. And again, Northeast Asia markets such as China, such as South Korea, such as Taiwan, they are at the forefront of the pickup in the electronic cycle. And I think that could well be a brighter spot for investors in the next couple of months.